Long ago, I made a build that converted hundreds, if not thousands of people into Solar Warlock mains, all using a fairly underrated exotic, that many people consider to be a bit of a meme. Sunbracers has always really had one perception in this community, and that it was fun as hell when it worked, but it was so hard to activate that it just wasn't viable in high-end content. But what if I told you that not only can you activate Sunbracers in high-end content with ease, but you can gain permanent restoration ×2, get your melee back immediately every time, and get supers in under 20 seconds, all without a single combat style mod. This video will serve the purpose of being my one-stop shop for if you want to learn to be a Sunbracers god. My favorite subclass is still Shadebinder, but in my opinion, this Sunbracers build is the overall most powerful build in the game. This build is going to reveal to you the hidden techs and abilities that you never knew existed on Sunbracers that'll push it from niche to S tier in any situation. To start off, we're just going to go over a quick overview of what we're going to talk about. First off, we'll go over the basic fragments and aspects you'll use, as well as how they fit together. We'll also talk a little bit about the ability rotation, but it's actually pretty simple compared to the stuff like my turret build. Next, we'll go over the most important tech that you'll be using, which is how to activate Sunbracers with solar ignitions. After that, we'll go over an extremely useful tech, the Dive Extension, which will let you gain restoration ×2 and extend it infinitely with solar ability or weapon kills. Next, we're going to split off and talk about Touch of Flame, and how to properly use your enhanced grenades, and more specifically, how to use them for boss damage, since they do ludicrous damage that rivals Starfire Protocol if you place them properly. After that, we'll talk about Icarus Dash and get to know when and when not to use it, as well as many movement techs such as well skating and snap hopping. Finally, to finish things off, we'll talk a little bit about some obscure techs that you may be able to find some use for, like animation canceling your Wall of Radiance activation to drop it quicker, and using Sunbracers to heal teammates. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, let's talk quickly about the aspects, fragments, and stats that make the build work. First, for aspects, you'll need heat rises, and the other aspect is up to your choice. We'll talk later about which aspect to choose in which situation, because both are very strong in specific situations. In general, I almost always prefer Touch of Flame, so use it by default if you just want to put something down for now. For fragments, you'll run the Ember of Ashes, Searing, Empyrean, and Singeing. Again, we'll explain these later, but for now, just know that the first three, being Ashes, Searing, and Empyrean, are extremely important to make the build function properly. Realistically, Singeing isn't a necessity for the function of the build, so if you want to swap something out, that's the one to swap. You'll also want Ashes to Assets and Momentum Transfer. You'll only need one stack of each. As for stats, you'll always want 100 Resilience, and then focus Recovery after that. For your secondary stats, I would run Intellect or Strength, and I run Intellect just because Strength and Discipline are almost useless to me, but realistically, Resil and Recover are the only ones that really matter here. I'm going to keep the gameplay loop section a bit short since I already have another video up that explains it pretty well, which I'll link in the description, but here's the gist of it. Throwing your melee and getting a kill in midair will return around 25% melee energy. After that, throwing a grenade at an enemy will return another 25%, leaving you at 50, and then Searing plus a kill from that grenade will return the last 50%. This means that killing an enemy with your melee grants you 5 free grenades to throw, and if one of those grenades gets a kill, your melee is fully refunded. This is where Searing comes in, since we may be falling short energy-wise without it, since Searing gives melee energy on enemies that die while scorched. One obvious problem you may see with this, however, is that it can be really difficult to consistently get kills with your melee in high-end content, especially when the melees on Solar Warlock are not the biggest sources of raw damage from the melee alone. This brings us to our next topic, which is how to activate Sunbracers with ignitions. Something really weird about Solar that very few other subclass debuffs have is that the offensive verbs Scorch and Ignition take on the characteristics of that which caused them. This means that Scorch and Ignitions caused by your melee will also count as melee damage, and thus have the ability to activate perks like Sunbracers that rely on kills from those abilities. You probably already know, but Ignitions do insane amounts of area damage, usually enough to completely vaporize any red bar regardless of content difficulty, and usually most orange bars as well. Fortunately for us, Incinerator Snap is completely built for causing ignitions. It applies 20 stacks of Scorch per pellet by default, and moves up to 30 per pellet with Ember of Ashes. With Ember of Ashes, you only need to land 4 pellets to ignite on your own. Ember of Ashes serves to make it easier to apply ignitions to targets with our Incinerator Snap, and thus makes it easier to activate Sunbracers in high-end content. Throwing Incinerator Snaps from above will also help, since the splash damage on the floor will apply the same amount of Scorch as a direct hit. On top of this, you can also use Solar Grenades to help you do this. Solar Grenades apply 20 Scorch stacks immediately to all enemies caught in the detonation when they land. This means if you only end up hitting 3 pellets of your Incinerator Snap, you can just throw a Solar Grenade at the enemy and they'll immediately ignite. For this reason, I usually save a grenade at the end of my Sunbracers rotation in high-end content. Not only can it be rotation saving by giving you an ignition that can keep your build running, but it can also be instrumental for jumping puzzles or just healing yourself or teammates in an emergency. Before you go any further, you'll really want to practice this. The ignition tech is the single most important part of this build. Things you'll want to keep in mind as you play is how different types of enemies will react to your snap. Some enemies, even in high level content, will instantly die to your snap, meaning you don't have to worry about ignitions. Other ones that are a bit meatier will take an entire ignition to die though. Some of them are even weirder, like enemies with very small hitboxes who are hard to hit, in which case you'll want to hit them with 3 pellets of your snap and then preemptively throw a solar grenade, since the chances that you will ignite them from a snap alone is very low. Another weird type that you come across may be those that almost die. For instance, Screebs oftentimes get put at a single point of health by the Snap and Grandmaster content, in which case you should just let the Scorch from the melee kill them. If you don't do this, the Detonation from the Solar Grenade may kill them instead. Getting to know your enemies and your activity is crucial, since it'll allow you to be able to tell what will happen when your melee is thrown and what to do in the event that an ignition doesn't start. In mid-level content, you'll probably be fine with rushing up and hitting enemies directly, but in high-end content like GMs, you should definitely run a blind grenade launcher, preferably with auto-loading holster. This will help you close the gap quickly and get your engine running much more safely. As we'll see later on, the most difficult part of this build is getting yourself started. Once you're on a roll, you're practically immortal. This build is just like a campfire, in that it can be finicky to get started with just a spark, but once it's going, it burns really, really hot. Next, we're going to talk about the next most important tech in this build, which will allow you to keep your survivability high to support your aggressive playstyle. This tech will allow you to immediately gain an extendable Restoration ×2 buff and keep it for a long time. Put simply, in order to do this, you need to get a kill while Phoenix diving with heat rises. Now, this seems simple on the surface, but it can be really difficult to pull off without the right strategy. There are two main ways to effectively do this. First is killing an enemy with the melee damage or the Scorch during the dive, and next is killing an enemy with ignitions during the dive. With both methods though, you'll need heat rises. If you're fighting an enemy that you know will die to your melee damage and won't ignite before they die, you'll want to throw your melee, and then immediately press dive once you see the projectiles leave your hand. The timing's fairly forgiving, and it won't be too hard to execute, and after the buff to Phoenix Dive and Lightfall, it'll become even easier. The next method, which you'll probably be using the most in high-end content, involves utilizing ignitions to activate your restoration. If you're fighting an enemy that you know won't die to the initial melee damage, you'll want to ignite them with your melee as described in the Sunbracers tech, and once you see the ignition start to glow, you'll want to dive. The key to this is waiting until after you see the ignition start. If you dive before the enemy ignites, or dive after the explosion happens, you'll miss your window. I usually dive the moment I see or hear the ignition begin, which is signaled by a growing orange light from the center of the enemy and a whooshing sound coming from them. And just a note from Editor Imagine, once Lightfall releases along with the buff to Phoenix Dive's base restoration timer, you always want to dive earlier rather than later, since it will now be long enough to support the time it takes for the ignition to go off. Realistically, you can disregard the previous section and just dive right when you see the melee fly out, but I'd still recommend waiting to see if the enemy ignites or not so you have time to throw a grenade if they don't. Once you master this tech along with ignition bracing, you'll have the basic tools you need to survive in Grandmaster content. I would again highly recommend practicing both of these techs before you go on further. Practice ignition bracing to activate Sunbracers reliably at high level content, as well as igniting at longer ranges with your snap grenade combo. All the while, you'll want to use your blinding grenade launcher to close the gap between you and your fuel. Next, we're going to talk about the rest of your loadout, focusing more on weapons and mods. Since you have almost all of your mods and weapon slots open, you're going to want to have to get used to reading the encounter and planning accordingly. For example, if you're playing a Grandmaster and your teammates are running Charge with Light builds, you may want to consider having Elemental Ordnance and Charge, as well as Powerful Friends. This will make it so that you give them free Charge with Light whenever you pick up a well, which will all come from your grenade kills. If you've got an Arc Titan on your team that would really benefit from a lot of Elemental Wells, you may want to put on Bountiful and Seeking, as well as a bunch of Well Generator mods, to help support their ability regen. In a raid scenario, you may want to get a little more creative with your damage rotations. You could run something like 4 times Argent Ordnance and a Taking Charge, with Izzy rocket swapping, and squeeze out as much damage as possible. Really, the sky's the limit. It's all about reading the encounter and deciding how best to leverage your mods to deal the maximum damage. One of the best builds to run in general for your mods is simply 3 times Font of Might, Elemental Ordnance, and Elemental Time Dilation. This will give you a 22-second Font of Might buff after picking up a well, making it more than viable for raid content. If you'd like to talk more about encounter-specific weapon and mod loadouts, please refer to my Discord in the description, because there are a ton of people that discuss stuff like this on the daily. The rest of this guide will mostly be focused on extra tricks and strategies. The previous ones are all about the basics of the build, so just getting it to work, but the following text will be all about squeezing the maximum amount of usefulness out of it in any given piece of content. First up, we're going to talk about Touch of Flame, and when to use it and what it can do for you. For our first intro to Touch of Flame, we're going to go into boss DPS, and how to extract the maximum benefit from Sunbracers. As you may know, solar grenades don't usually stack with each other, but when you have Touch of Flame equipped, they do partially stack because of the lava blobs that come out. Touch of Flame grenades fire off lava balls in one of 8 places around the ring of the solar grenade, that come out of the dead center and arc through the air towards one of the 8 nodes around the perimeter of the grenade. The path they take is parabolic, and they only explode when they hit a floor surface or an enemy, so they bounce off of walls and ceilings, and we'll get to this later. If you have any enemies available during a boss phase, you can kill them with your melee while running Melee Wellmaker and Font of Might to gain both Sunbracers grenades to deal significant extra damage, as well as Font to gain bonus weapon damage. These grenades are extremely powerful against some bosses, and lackluster against others. The reason for this is that bosses who tend to catch more of the lava blobs will take up more damage in the end. We can split up boss models into a few main groups to see what you should do. First up, tall, thin bosses are the worst for Sunbracers DPS, and these include things like Daughters of Oryx or Rolk. The reason why they're so bad is because they catch very few lava balls, since the lava basically only hits their legs with the balls that shoot out of the sides of the grenade. Shorter, thinner bosses are few and far between, but these are essentially the same thing. Next up, we have short to medium height and moderately thick bosses, like War Priest. These guys are pretty decent since they have the potential to catch a few more lava balls than the thinner guys do due to them having a little bit more girth. Next up is moving bosses. The reason why moving bosses are so good is that they move, and essentially cover a wider area, possibly colliding with currently moving lava balls that normally wouldn't have hit them. This seems like a bit of a shaky effect, since the chances of a boss walking into an in-flight lava ball is pretty low on its own, but in practice, the damage kicks itself up to ludicrous levels. In this screenshot, Zephyr was using Starfire Protocol grenades, and I used Parasite with Sunbracers on Atheon, who is a moderately tall and thin boss that walks around. Next up, we have the short, thick boys, like Morgoth and Golgoroth. These guys are good for one big reason. It's that they're so thick that oftentimes grenades thrown directly under them will hit almost all of their lava balls, making Sunbracers an extremely viable option for DPS workup, where you throw them right out the gate as DPS starts and then go for weapon damage, using the Sunbracers as a boost like a damage super. Golgoroth is kind of a weird case though, because Golgoroth has an immunity plating on his underside, forcing you to throw the grenade inside of his chest cavity in order to be able to damage it properly. Golgoroth fits a size requirement, but is usually worse than Morgoth simply because throwing grenades into his chest cavity causes one or two of the nodes of your grenades to fly out the other side and not hit him. Either way, Golgoroth still takes tremendous damage from Sunbracers since only one or two nodes hit him, and the nades can be on the whole time. I usually manage to hit about 8.25 million damage total in a single phase on Golgoroth by using triple swapping grenade launchers. I activated Sunbracers on the enemy and then had two Demolitionist autoloading GLs with Parasite and GL holster to reload my Parasite. Golgoroth is just an example of how you need to think regarding bosses. Of course, testing them yourself is always a great option, but think to yourself in a boss fight, what factors affect this? Does the boss move? What resources do you have at your disposal? Does he only take damage from one spot? Etc. Use your intuition. Finally, the safest and most powerful bosses to use for Sunbracers is on gigantic bosses like Riven and Oryx. Put simply, these bosses are so big that Sunbracers will hit every single lava ball almost every time. Oryx catches so many of these so quickly that everyone's game will oftentimes drop to 30 or 40 frames on good PCs because of all the particle effects. In the end, the thicker and shorter the boss is, the better these work. If they're thin, I'd only recommend forcing Sunbracers to work if they move around a lot, or if you have adds at your disposal readily. I wouldn't really recommend forcing yourself to go out of your way to proc Sunbracers on something that's really tall and thin. But if the resources are readily available, go for it. Finally, we're going to talk about a specific tech that you can do with these that someone may be able to find a use for. I know I found a couple. If you remember back, I said that these lava globs reflect off of surfaces that aren't a floor. What this means is that since the lava globs reflect off of ceilings, if you throw a solar grenade at the ceiling, it'll rain down lava blobs like a thundercloud in a much more concentrated area, since you end up cancelling out all of the upward momentum of the blob, giving it much less time to deviate from the center. On very few select bosses like Daughters of Oryx, it's actually almost always a better idea to place one solar grenade at their feet to get the solar grenade damage itself, and then throw the other four at the ceiling directly above them. This will significantly concentrate the lava balls close to the center, and allow the boss to be hit by almost all of them. You've got to have some really good intuition with angles, and an even better throwing arm, but if you can get it down, it can be incredibly useful in niche situations. Speaking of grenade placement, we're going to talk a little bit on how to properly use Touch of Flame to place your grenades. You'll really want to be placing them down in one of two places. One is on spawn doors, and being able to place grenades on spawn doors can be extremely valuable for both yourself and your team. This can also extend to preemptively placing grenades where you know enemies will be. Even if it isn't a spawn door, if you know of a place where enemies will eventually wander towards, it can be really valuable to set up before them. The second way is to stack grenades on majors or bosses like champions or on pre-existing adds. When trying to kill pre-existing adds, having good game sense is crucial, since you can significantly increase your range by knowing where enemies are on the map, since you can throw solar grenades at a ridiculous range. In the event that you know enemies are on the field somewhere, but have an obstacle between yourself and them, you can once again rely on the Touch of Flame to help you. If you throw grenades at the ceiling directly above the enemies on the floor, Touch of Flame will cause your grenades to rain down lava onto them, effectively allowing you to throw your grenades to any spawn door or location on the map as long as you can hit a location above them. Next, before we get into Icarus Dash, we're going to take a quick detour and talk a little bit about Heat Rises. Heat Rises, when active, will give you infinite glide duration. What this means is that your glide will effectively never run out, even though it doesn't mean you can stay in the air forever in most cases. In essence, you'll still float downwards slowly with Heat Rises, but your glide will never disable. There are two major things you could do with this. Firstly, we need to talk about momentum and gliding in general. Gliding in Destiny freezes the amount of momentum you currently have, applying both a resistance factor and a burst of initial speed if you're running burst or balance glide. This resistance factor is essentially a scalar that gets applied to all gravitational acceleration applied to you. The scalar is a very low value, making it so that gravity barely affects you at all. This is oftentimes why Warlock Glide is really hard to use for most players, because it requires you to set up your jump trajectory before you even hit the jump button. This resistance factor makes it so that gravity doesn't affect you as much, making it easier to reach your destination, but the very short bursts of speed can make it difficult to change trajectories. Heat Rises essentially makes your glide infinitely long as the buff stays up. What this means is that the resistance factor stays active the entire time, allowing you to effectively climb walls. Let's look at a slanted wall. In Destiny 2, slanted surfaces act a little differently to flat ones. Instead of simply moving you horizontally when you walk onto them, they actually give you a little bit of vertical movement as well so you can climb. This vertical movement is almost always cancelled out by gravity, but heat rises allows gravity to be weak enough that the vertical force takes precedence. If you take a wall that has any kind of upward slant, you can pop heat rises and activate your glide and hold forward. While you do this, you'll infinitely flood up the wall as long as the slant remains. This is because the game sees the wall as a slant and gives you a slight upward force to propel you up the slant. Normally, gravity takes over, but your glide's resistance factor allows you to overcome gravity by using this upward slant force. Heat rises just lets you keep doing this for much longer than a normal glide would. We'll talk a little on this later, but this can be incredibly useful for jumping puzzles, as it essentially allows you to scale any slanted wall if you have heat rises. Now that we've covered Touch of Flame and heat rises, we're going to cover the other aspect of Solar Warlock, which is Icarus Dash. This section won't entirely be focused on Icarus Dash, but rather be focused on movement in general, and we'll go over some unique tricks you can do with Icarus Dash when trying to use it over Touch of Flame. First, we're going to talk about the methods of movement that don't require any specific weapons like an eager edge sword, starting with Warlock Skating. Typically, Warlock Skating or Glide Skating is done with Burst Glide, so we're going to go over that first. Put simply, to Warlock Skate, you want to sprint, double jump, and then immediately turn off your glide. Right as you hit the ground, you instantly jump again and do the same activate/deactivate. The reason for this is because Burst Glide multiplies your current momentum at the very beginning before becoming a normal glide. So, you can turn it on for the speed boost, and then immediately turn it off afterwards to keep that speed since the glide portion tries to slow you down. On Dawnblade though, I actually recommend Strafe Glide if you're running Heat Rises. The reason for this is because for some reason, with Heat Rises active, Strafe Glide actually grants a stronger burst of speed than Burst Glide does, while Burst Glide's speed boost is dampened. The skating with Strafe Glide works the exact same way, you just have to have Heat Rises on. I'd recommend running Burst Glide for situations where you aren't going to have Heat Rises on very often, but typically I run Strafe Glide for the vast majority of content for the extra speed. Next up, we're going to talk about how to use Icarus Dash to further multiply your momentum. Icarus Dash usually just propels you in a single direction, but if you activate Burst Glide right before activation and then activate it directly afterwards again, it lets you keep a part of the momentum from the dash. We can use this to Icarus Dash skate, by sprinting, jumping, and then activating Glide, dashing, and then activating Glide again. Once you've done this combo, you'll want to deactivate your Glide and then repeat. In essence, you're doing the normal glide skating method, but you're inserting an Icarus Dash into the glide activation part, so instead of immediately activating and then deactivating your glide, you instead do a glide-dash-glide combo, and then deactivate and repeat. You can chain one of these into a regular Warlock skate to keep your momentum afterwards, and just like before, Strafe Glide with Heat Rises active also works, and is the faster of the two methods. Something to note is that Icarus skating oftentimes won't work on heavily slanted surfaces. You'll need something that's at least somewhat flat, although it's fairly forgiving. And last, we're going to talk about a tech called Snap Hopping. This tech is very difficult to learn and pull off, so don't be disappointed if you can't get it immediately. In essence, Snap Hop allows you to gain an extra burst of speed at the beginning of an Icarus Dash skate, allowing you to go much faster than you normally can. The idea behind this tech is that for some reason, most Warlock charged melee abilities allow you to actually cancel your slide if you press your super key without a full super, and with a full charge melee. The actual mechanism as to why this works isn't fully understood yet, but in essence, here's what you do. You want to have your melee ability charged and your super uncharged. You want to sprint, slide, and press both jump and your super button at the same time. This will cancel your slide animation to a really fast moving jump. Once you've got that down, you can then chain it into an Icarus Dash skate. The timing on this is extremely tight, which is why it's so hard. In the end, you'll be canceling your slide into a hop, then glide-dash-glide, unglide, and continue with the skate. When done properly, this tech will grant you the ability to move much faster than you can without a sword, and can be extremely useful when mastered. And now, we're going to get into the movement methods that you can use with an Eager Edge sword. Both the Half-Truths and other Half-Swords from Dares of Eternity can roll with Eager Edge, which massively improves lunge speed and range for a second after pulling out the sword. They're also both craftable. This perk has a cooldown of 3 seconds and starts the moment the lunge buff ends, meaning you can use the sword and then keep it in your hand and it'll start cooling down. First things first, we'll go over the basic Eager Edge skate. Swapping to your sword, swinging, and then swapping back to another weapon will allow you to keep the momentum you had from the sword swing. Then you can continue glide skating like you normally would, and you'll skate along with an extra huge burst of momentum. You can also do this with Icarus Dash skating, making yourself go even faster. Using this burst of speed is one of the biggest methods of movement on Dawnblade with a sword, since it can be done on almost any piece of ground, and grants you some pretty insane speeds. However, it's not the fastest. If you've ever seen Dawnblades doing jumping puzzles, you've probably seen them launch themselves at practically maximum speed off a ledge, flying directly over the entire puzzle. This is oftentimes called well skating, and allows you to use your Eager Edge sword to launch yourself extremely quickly over any ledge. In order to do it, you need to be on the ledge first, and I recommend it being a high cliff at the very beginning when you're not used to it, since the higher the ledge, the easier it is to pull off. You'll switch to your sword, swing a heavy attack, and then immediately after hit space and your super key almost at the exact same time. You can pretty reliably do swap swing and then immediately hit both of your jump and super buttons at the same time. If you do it correctly, you'll launch off the platform. If you wait too long before you're swinging your jump super combo, you'll just flop off the ledge. If you hit your super jump too early, you'll pop your well while still on the ledge. Before trying to do any of the next few techs, I'd recommend practicing the basic well skate. Just go up to a ledge, swap to your sword, swing, and then immediately hit both jump and super at the same time. Once you're consistent, you can try separating your jump and super keys a tiny bit. Realistically, the largest amount of speed you can obtain from well skating will come from swinging your heavy and then hitting jump just before exiting the ledge, and then hitting super within a few frames of leaving the ledge. The closer you get to this timing, the more speed you'll get. Mind you, there's some diminishing returns here. The timing between the jump and well pop has to be accurate within a couple hundredths of a second, and it takes a ton of practice to properly gain the best speed. If you can't seem to get any faster immediately, don't worry, you'll get better as you do it in-game. But to move on, we're going to talk about what you can actually do with well skate. First and most obviously, you can do both glide skating straight out of the skate as well as Icarus Dash skating. And secondly, we'll talk about a bit of a definition of a ledge in this case. A ledge in well skating terms only means an area that sharply dips down in around 45 degrees or more. This means that oftentimes bumps in the ground or even simply small rocks more than a quarter to half meter off the ground will work with well skating. And as you can see in the example, you can well skate off of pretty much anything. And finally, we're going to talk about how to do something called momentum reflection. It may be obvious, but with as much momentum as you have with well skating, it can be very, very difficult to change directions. There is a trick that you can use involving Icarus Dash though. If you're moving at very high speeds into a slanted object, you can Icarus Dash right before you hit it. The Icarus Dash will allow your momentum to reflect off of objects like a ping pong ball, causing you to reflect off of that slant. You can use this to quickly make 90-degree turns or even propel yourself to ridiculous heights. And then last up, we're going to talk about two very quick techs to close off the video. These two didn't really fit into any specific category, so I'm putting them here. First off is the well insta-pop. If you pop well in the same frame as hitting the ground after jumping, you'll skip the well animation, allowing you to get to damaging with your weapons much faster than you normally would. This also works with Phoenix Dive if you like to practice. The second one is less of a tech and more of just a strategy, but with Sunbracers, don't be afraid to use your infinite grenades to heal yourself or teammates with heat rises. Consuming your grenade will heal all nearby teammates, allowing you to effectively become a battle medic if needed. And that's all I've got. If you got any questions, leave me a comment or join my Discord in the description below and at me. I typically respond to messages much faster than DMs, so please do that instead of sending it to me directly. I've also got a day 1 raid team matchmaker bot running in the server that will automatically match you with teammates of similar skill level and good subclass synergy. Details are in the announcements channel. Please like and sub if you like what I do, and I'll see you next time.